Welcome to Part 2 on Public Opinion. In politics, public opinion polls are used for many reasons. Political scientist Herbert Asher noted, polling plays an integral role in political events at the national, state, and local levels. In any major event or decision, poll results are sure to be a part of the news media coverage and the decision-makers' deliberations. In addition, public opinion polls help determine who those decision-makers will be. Candidates for public office use polls to determine their initial name recognition, the effectiveness of their campaign strategy, their opponents' weaknesses, and how potential voters are responding to their message. Once elected to office, policymakers often rely on public opinion polls to gauge their constituents' opinions and to measure how well they are performing on the job. The process of conducting a public opinion poll consists of several steps. Those conducting the poll first need to determine the population they are targeting for the survey, the group of people whose opinions are of interest and about whom information is desired. For example, if your neighbor were considering running for the U.S. House of Representatives, she would want to know how many people recognize her name, but she would be interested only in those people who live in your congressional district. Furthermore, she would probably narrow this population by looking only at those people in the district who are registered to vote. She might even want to narrow her target population further by limiting her survey to likely voters, perhaps those who have voted in past congressional elections. The sponsor of any poll, whether a candidate, a political party or group, or a news organization, needs to determine what information is desired from survey respondents. Sometimes this information is relatively clear. News media organizations track presidential approval ratings each month, for example. But other times this process might be more complex. Polling organizations construct polls carefully to ensure that the questions actually measure what the client wants to know. Pollsters also recognize that many factors, including question design and question order, influence the responses. For example, we will be looking at some data on how Americans identify themselves ideologically. 5% identify themselves as very liberal, 16% as liberal, 36% as moderate, 31% as conservative, and 9% as very conservative. But other Gallup surveys have indicated that when pollsters changed the term liberal to progressive, in half of the survey sent to respondents, those who received the questionnaire with the progressive alternative responded quite differently. In general, people were more likely to identify themselves as moderates or as progressives when the terminology was used. This simple change in terminology indicates that Americans may be more likely to identify themselves as conservative when the opposing term liberal is used, rather than when the opposing term progressive is used. Sampling. Once the target population is determined and the survey measurement instrument or poll is designed, pollsters then must select a sample that will represent the view of this population. Because it is nearly impossible to measure all the opinions of any given population, pollsters frequently rely on random sampling, a scientific method of selection in which either member of the population has an equal chance at being included in the sample. Relying on random sampling helps to ensure that the sample is not skewed so that one component of the population is overrepresented. To demonstrate this point, suppose the dean of students asks your class to conduct a public opinion survey that will measure whether students believe that parking facilities are adequate at your school. In this case, the population you need to measure is the entire student body. But clearly, how you do this, how you conduct the sampling will affect the responses. If you ask only students in your 8 a.m. American government class, you might find that they have little trouble parking because the campus is not crowded at that hour. If you ask students who attend classes only during peak hours, you might get different, yet not necessarily representative views as well, since these students may have more difficulty parking than average. How then would you obtain a random sample? The best way would be to ask the registrar for the list of all students, determine your sample size, randomly select every 10th student from the list, contact each 10th student, and ask his or her views. Researchers have noted, however, that one problem with polls is that even those conducting use random samples may not provide the accurate data needed to illuminate political opinions and behaviors. Part of the problem is that randomization can only go so far. One standard method for conducting telephone surveys is to use random digit dialing of telephones. Many polling organizations still exclude cellular lines from their population. But even those that include cell phone subscribers face a high rate of non-response because of the nearly universal use of caller ID and the transportable nature of cell phones that make their owners unwilling to participate in surveys. But today, 20% of the U.S. population relies exclusively on cell phones and has no landline. How might cell phone users be different from those who use only landlines? People who rely exclusively on landlines are likely to be older than cellies only, those that only have cell phones. Indeed, one study found that 33% of young adults aged 18 to 29 years lived in cell phone-only households. And some individuals who eliminate landlines from their homes do so in order to save money. In fact, in 2008, adults living in poverty were nearly twice as likely to rely on cell phones exclusively compared with those with higher incomes. So by eliminating cell phone users from a potential sample, pollsters eliminate individuals who may be poorer or more concerned with the economy than those who pay to keep a landline. One way pollsters attempt to address these types of concerns is through the use of quota sample, a more scientifically sophisticated method of sampling than random sampling. A pollster using this method structures the sample so that it is representative of the characteristics of the target population. Let's say your mother is running for mayor of your town and you would like to conduct a poll that measures opinions of her among various constituencies. From census data, you learn that your town is 40% white, 35% African American, 20% Latino, and 5% Asian. Therefore, at a citywide event, you structure your sample so that it reflects the proportions of the population. With a sample of 200 voters, you would seek to include 80 white respondents, 70 African Americans, 40 Latinos, and 10 Asians. Pollsters routinely rely on quota sampling, though often they may not ask participants about their demographic characteristics until the end of the poll. Another method used to address problems is sampling is stratified sampling, in which the national population is divided into fourths, and certain areas within these regions are selected as representative of the national population. Although some organizations still rely on quota sampling, larger organizations and media polls now use stratified sampling, the most reliable form of random sample. Today, nearly every major polling organization relies on U.S. Census data as the basis of their 4 sampling regions. Stratified sampling is the basis for much of the public opinion data used by political scientists and other social scientists, and particularly in the GSS, or General Social Survey, and the National Election Study. All right, let's talk about sampling error. As we have seen, to accurately gauge public opinion, pollsters must obtain an accurate sample from the population they are polling. A sample need not be large to reflect the population's views. In fact, most national polling organizations rarely sample more than 1,500 respondents. Most national samples range from 1,000 to 1,500 to poll small populations. States or congressional districts, for example. Polling organizations routinely use samples of between 300 and 500 respondents. The key is having a sample that accurately reflects the population. Let's say that your political science instructor offers extra credit if you attend a weekly study group. The group initially convenes immediately after your regular class session. At the conclusion of the study group, the leader asks if this is a convenient time for everyone to meet. Since everyone present has attended the study group, chances are that that time is more convenient for them than it is for those students who did not attend. Perhaps because they have another class immediately after your political science class, or they work during that time period, or they have childcare responsibilities. In other words, the composition of the sample, in this case the students in study group, will skew their responses to this question. Similarly, if a poll is administered to a non-representative sample of a population, the response will not accurately reflect the population's views. In selecting a representative sample, pollsters need to pay particular attention to the time of day a poll is administered. Afternoons yield a disproportionate number of mothers with small children and retirees, and evenings may yield more affluent individuals who do not do shift work. And today's telephone technology presents pollsters with even more obstacles. As we have seen, many potential respondents, particularly young people, have opted out of telephone landlines in favor of cell phones, making them a subset of the population that is more difficult for pollsters to reach. People with caller ID or both cell and landlines frequently screen out unknown numbers of those of survey research companies. Internet polls present their own set of obstacles, including the ability of some individuals to complete surveys or vote for their favorite reality show contestant repeatedly. Nonetheless, market research firms, public opinion polling organizations, and even political candidates are increasingly relying on the Internet as a survey research tool. Some organizations, such as the Harris Poll online, offer memberships. Poll respondents can earn rewards for completing surveys that help the organization create a representative sample of their target population. To adjust for problems with sampling, every poll that relies on a sample has a sampling error, sometimes called a margin of error, which is a statistical calculation of the difference in results between a poll of randomly drawn sample and a poll of the entire population. Most polls have a sampling error of plus or minus 3 percentage points. This means 3 percentage points should be added and subtracted from the poll results to find the range of the population. Okay, let's talk about types of polls. Today, the process of measuring political opinions has evolved drastically from the days of the Literary Digest straw poll or even George Gallup's first successful predictions of the results of presidential elections. Political candidates, parties, and news organizations rely on several types of polls, depending on their goals and objectives. These include tracking polls, push polls, and exit polls. Tracking polls measure changes in public opinion over the course of days, weeks, or months by repeatedly asking respondents the same questions and measuring changes in opinion. Since the 1992 presidential election, tracking polls have been an important tool, particularly for presidential candidates seeking to glean information about how campaign strategy has affected public opinion. Tracking polls are useful in indicating the effectiveness of the media strategy, the success of a day's worth of campaigning, or whether the campaign has gotten its message across in the most recent news cycle. Push polls are a special type of poll that both provides information to campaigns about candidates' strengths and weaknesses and attempts to skew public opinion about a candidate. At their best, push polls help gauge voter priorities so that a campaign can better target its message. The campaign can then determine whether to accentuate that message. But push polls have an unsavory reputation because some campaigns and organizations have used them to smear an opponent. Doing so in the hypothetical structure of push polls enables one campaign to make often baseless accusations against an opponent without having to substantiate the charges. For example, in the 2010 Republican primary for Utah's Senate seat between then-Senator Robert Bennett and one of his challengers, Mike Lee, who had the backing of the Tea Party activists, a group unaffiliated with Lee's campaign used a push poll against Bennett. In the conservative state, a push poll asked if it would make a difference if the respondent knew that Bennett introduced a bill that would provide federal funds for abortions and if they knew that Bennett supported health care to homosexuals. Other questions, as you can see from the screen that I found from push polls, is would you be less likely to vote for candidate if you knew that he was gay? Would you be less likely to vote for candidate Z if you knew she was a single mother? Would you be less likely to vote for candidate W if you knew that he had an extramarital affair? So it's the campaign trying to push information out that is usually baseless. Exit polls are conducted at polling places on election day to project the winner of an election before the polls close. News organizations frequently sponsor exit polls, which help them predict the outcome of gubernatorial, congressional, and presidential elections. Because of exit polls, news organizations can frequently predict the outcome of a given election shortly after the polls have closed. Exit polls also provide the media, candidates, and political parties with information about why voters voted the way that they did. Exit polls are how the media calls each of the states, and they'll say 1%, 2%, 5% of the polling places have reported their results. This is what got us into trouble in the 2000 election.